welcome. Please come and take a seat and we'll get started. So in this session, we are delighted to be officially launching the first part of a field guide to fake news, which is the first project of a new initiative called the Public Data Lab, in collaboration with and with support from First Draft. So thank you very much for being here today with us, especially late on a Friday afternoon in this beautiful city. Instead of cutting a ribbon or smashing a bottle, I guess this will have to be it. This is the moment. It's now live. You can sort of get the guide at this link.
And there's also printed.
And there's also a printed. There is one of these in the world, so this is sort of it. We could maybe pass it around if anyone's interested in having a look. So this is the first 3 chapters of a collaboration that we've been doing. But just to kind of say what we're going to kind of do in this session, first of all, Liliana and I are going to say a little bit about what the guide is and why we were interested in creating it, what it does and what we'd like to do with it next. And that potentially may involve working with some of the people in this room, other people who are sort of interested in exploring its various sort of recipes and approaches. Then our colleagues here from Density Design at the Politecnico di Milano, Michele and Angeles, are going to tell us a little bit more about the design process and data visualizations that are intended to facilitate different ways of exploring and understanding fake news phenomena online. And then we're delighted to have Claire Wardle with us from First Draft, who's been extremely busy on lots of panels, I think, who will say a little bit about where the guide fits within First Draft's broader kind of mission to improve skills and standards around the reporting and sharing of information that emerges online. And finally, last but not least, we will hear from the great Craig Silverman of BuzzFeed News, whose innovative and in-depth investigations have really raised the bar, I think, for reporting around this issue, as well as sort of around platforms and sort of the web in general. And who'll talk a little bit about some recent, a recent collaboration and potentially some other collaborations that we'll be doing around this area. But that is not the end. So after this session, we'll go to the Profani Bar. So anyone who is potentially interested in catching up about any of this work and who might be interested in road testing some of these approaches, please come and talk to us. We'll be in the bar. So I guess first of all, we are extremely happy to be back in Perugia again. As I mentioned in a panel earlier this week, it was 5 years ago this month when we first launched a project called the Data Journalism Handbook here at the festival. And there are several of the people in the room today, I think Farida and a few others who are also involved in that. A huge amount has happened in the last 5 years in this field and in the world generally. So we're currently working on a new edition of the book to reflect some of these changes. And over the past few years, Liliana and I have had one foot in the world of kind of data journalism and worlds of data journalism and data activism. Liliana's been involved heavily with the European Journalism Centre's data journalism program, and I've helped to establish an international civil society organization called Open Knowledge International. And we've also had one other foot in the world of research, in particular sort of in the fields of digital methods and science and technology studies. So the guide is part of a series of interventions to try to facilitate productive encounters between these two worlds, between journalism and activism on the one hand and research on the other, to see how they might be able to learn from each other. And our broad objective is to enrich public debate, reportage, policy making and practice around fake news. That's a sort of broader aim, and to catalyse collective inquiry, drawing on different fields of expertise and experience that are required to make sense of this complex and fast-evolving issue. So the work is inspired by a long democratic pragmatist tradition going back to people like John Dewey that proposes to look more closely at the composition of democratic societies, what they do, how they are organised, and what moves them and holds them together. With the Public Data Lab, we're very aware of the limitations and our finitude as a small network of researchers. Hence is our greatest hope that the value of this guide will not be what lies within its pages, but what other people, other organizations, other journalists will will go and do with it. So that's what we'd like to kind of talk with you more about a little bit later. Our focus has been less on a particular set of findings than on providing a set of procedures and approaches which can be used to find fresh perspectives and different ways of looking at the issue. So we suggest a shift in the guide from the formal content of fake news phenomenon to understanding its circulation and its social life online. And this shift suggests the limits of an approach which is exemplified by what has been called the information deficit model of communication, which might imply that fake news thrives because of a deficit of factual information. In the guide, we suggest new ways of mapping and responding to fake news beyond identifying and fact-checking suspect claims, including thicker accounts of circulation as a way to develop richer understandings of how fake news moves and mobilizes people, and more nuanced accounts of fakeness and what it is, responses which are more attuned to the phenomenon. So, as we mentioned in the introduction, we adopt the metaphor of a field guide to encourage people to explore different ways of following how fake news moves in the wild. We also adopt the metaphor of a recipe book as we give people a set of procedures that are intended to provide a starting point for experimenting with different ways of approaching this issue and the sort of phenomena that are associated with it. And finally, we adopt the metaphor of a mystery thriller, as in the pursuit of solving an apparently relatively straightforward and simple crime, we find that the plot thickens, the cast grows, the questions multiply, and there may be many unexpected twists or changes of perspective along the way. And this is something that we wrote about for a piece for the Nieming Lab, which came out in the early hours of this morning, which looks at how, in investigating fake news, we also learn many interesting things about ourselves and about collective life online. Fake news, we contend, involves more than a few rogue producers or state conspiracies and raises important and also difficult questions about the digital technologies that organize collective life. And so now you have a sense of some of our aspirations in putting together the guide. We'll give you a preview of some of its content organized around 4 observations around fake news that have emerged from our research.
Yeah, so I get the pleasure to run you through some of the things that are in the sample of the field guide that is online as of today. And I will also give you a preview of some of the things which are not yet in this version of the field guide, but which will be released in early May. So as Jonathan mentioned, the field guide is organized into methodological recipes to open up imagination about how fake news can be investigated and understood. But for the purposes of this presentation, I will organize these into 4 propositions about fake news, which I will try to illustrate with some of the empirical work from the guide. So you can see them here on the screen, and I will go through each of them very briefly. And these are also based on a forthcoming paper proposing some new lines of inquiry about fake news done with colleagues in Copenhagen and Paris. The first proposition explored in the guide is that, also as Claire's work suggests, rather than focusing on the distinction between true and false, between fake and real, we should consider investigating the full spectrum of fabricated, half-baked, contested, alternative, and temporary facts. And in the field guide, we illustrate this through a case study on Russian information campaigning online. So Russia's online information campaigning has been described as being part of a form of hybrid warfare, whereby a weaker power provides strategic narrative input to amplify existing splits in targeted societies, as well as to undermine trust in democratic institutions. In the guide, we explore different shades of fabrication in a collection of Russian misinformation stories compiled by East Stratcom and the European Disinformation Review. So the European Disinformation Review is an EU service to address Russia's ongoing disinformation campaigns. So contributors to the field guide identified 3 flavors or 3 styles of Russian information campaigning online. So there is what we are accustomed to refer to as fake news. So that's fabricated stories served as clickbait to generate ad revenue, and that also mimics some of the features of mainstream news stories. So the focus on personalities, the focus on human interest, and so on. There is also a lot of conspiracy, which is really interesting. So these are more complex plots that multiply actors and their connections. And there is also disinformation. So this takes the style of hard facts and acts as a weapon to disorient and undermine established Western institutions and information cultures. And this is one of our favorite conspiracies that we found in this collection, and that features the CIA, Michael Jackson, and a lot of other actors also. So it basically says, data from a Russian satellite revealed a strong electromagnetic radiation pulse was fired on Michael Jackson's whereabouts immediately before his death. CIA needed to get rid of him because he was to warn the world before an immediate mass genocide of Palestinians through his song, "We've Had Enough." So it's like a very complex narrative, a lot of things going on here. So the next proposition explored in the guide is that false knowledge claims are not born fake news. To become fake news, they need to mobilize large numbers of allies and engagement, but also opponents to contest, flag, and debunk them. And we generically call these in the guide publics. Just to explain, so not every lie or piece of false information online that mimics the news style is called fake news. It's only when it generates a lot of engagement that an item becomes labeled as fake news. So we propose two methods to explore the circulation of fake news online. The first is by mapping the publics of fake news on Facebook, and the second is by mapping the circulation of fake news on the web. And we'll start with a few examples from the Facebook case study. And the first thing to say is that it's not easy to do research of circulation on Facebook because of the restrictive architecture of the platform. So we ended up focusing on public pages and groups, which is why we call this mapping hotspots rather than the full trajectory of a story. So we examined the circulation of over 20 popular fake news stories about the US elections, coming from a list that we received from Craig. And we found that the public pages and groups that successfully share the highest number of fake news stories related to the US elections are primarily pro-Trump supporters and anti-Hillary groups. And if we look at how Facebook pages and groups cluster based on the stories that they share, we see that the core of the network is made up of Trump supporters animated by anti-Hillary stories. Amongst the publics energized by fake news about the US elections, what seems interesting to us are grassroots activists for a variety of issues, but also political candidate, what we call loyalists, so that's pro-Trump mostly, but also pro-Hillary and pro-Bernie, as well as entertainers. So that can be anything from like comedian pages, pages of entertainment shows, and so on. And an important question for us here is how fake news animates these publics. So what is the context of the posting? Is the post shared uncritically? Is it called out as fake? Is it used for communities to support their own causes, and so on? And these are really important questions, but they are also questions that are difficult to answer in the case of Facebook, because early measures to counter fake news mean that the posts that share fake news items have been removed. And this creates significant problems for research and for really understanding what happened through these postings. So throughout this project, we've ended up from researching fake news to starting a call for an archiving project for fake news. So maybe we should also think about archiving this phenomenon so we can understand what happened. One final point here is whether fact-checking initiatives are reaching the publics of fake news on Facebook. And what this visualization shows us is that fake news and fact-check corrections mobilize quite different publics on Facebook. So we found that there were only a handful of the hundreds of pages that shared fake news stories that have prominently acknowledged the debunked corrections of these stories. So while, as we will see in the next case, Google as a device gives us the account of the debunkers, on Facebook it is fake news stories that generate more engagement and debunked corrections that circulate poorly. So if we look at the circulation of fake news with Facebook, we get the publics of fake news, and we also run into the problem of deleted posts. But as the next analysis will show, if we look at the circulation of fake news with Google, what we see is something quite different. We see the effects of the fact checkers on the fake news landscape. So moving on to Google, tracing the circulation of fake news with Google is also not easy. And this is for a number of reasons. Citation practices may vary. Non-citation is used as a strategy by fact checkers, which means that we increasingly see debunkers at the top of Google results for fake news stories. So to do this analysis, we basically used a depersonalized research browser. We captured all available instances of a fake news story in the top 100 results, their dates of publication, the sources which they cite, how citation is done, and so on. And we plotted all of these on a timeline, which is what you see here. And what we get here is basically an instance of circulation from the viewpoint of the search engine. And this is the case of the Pope endorses Trump item, where each dot is an article about the story. Orange lines represent citations used to endorse the fake news item. Green lines represent citations that debunk the news. And what this shows us is that the story originated on an explicitly satirical website, and when it was published on this website, it had hardly any circulation. However, in late September, what we call a fake news site, Ending the Fed, picked up the story and circulated it as fake news, that is without indicating that it's satire. And what we see is that after this, we see what we call this, the laundering of the story by Ending the Fed, triggering what we call an immune response from debunkers. So we see a lot of activity after the story was published by this laundering agent. Yeah, so one thing that this helps us understand is that there are different roles that different actors play in the circulation of fake news. So you have original sources, which may be satirical sites. You have laundering agents, which repost stories and reframe them as real. And you have what we call the immune response from debunkers, which this generates. Yeah, so we see that, to sum up, when we look at Facebook and at Google, we get quite different stories about how fake news travels. Moving on to the third proposition that we explore in the guide, which is that successful fabrications, and this is really important, they are not limited to the news format. In fact, there are different formats that do well on different platforms. And in the guide, we illustrate this with a case study on how political memes function as vectors of post-truth politics on Facebook. Yeah, so more specifically, we're interested in if and how memes editorialize key political and media events. Yeah, so what colleagues of ours did was to do a text and context analysis of a number of political memes and image repositories on Facebook to see whether we can detect different visual styles for how these memes editorialize events. And while I don't have time to go into this, what we basically see is that different meme pages have different editorial styles. So this is Breitbart, in case some of you recognize content from its Facebook page. So in the case of Breitbart, we see very text-intensive editorialized memes, often focusing on news content. And this is the case of another very peculiar political meme repository called God Emperor Trump. Are people familiar with that? No, you don't hang out on meme repositories that much. Yeah, so what we see here is a very different editorial style. So you see more visually complex, more cryptic, more comic, animation-like memes. And so more generally, so why are memes important? Why is it important to look at memes when we speak about misinformation? So what we learned from this study is that memes participate in propagandistic efforts, but this is not a case of top-down propaganda, where the agenda is set at the top and it's disseminated. What we are seeing is more of a grassroots type of agenda setting, which our colleagues very nicely called DIY propaganda, so do-it-yourself propaganda, and which, as they suggest, calls for a rethinking of the relationship between participatory culture and agenda setting. And finally, the last proposition, and I will keep this very short because Craig will speak a bit more about this also. So this last proposition is that the difference between real and fake news is not just about the claims made in these articles. More importantly, these are underpinned by very different production histories. And here we focused only on one aspect of these production histories, namely the use of web trackers by these websites. And by web trackers, we mean small bits of code embedded in these websites that are used to collect various kinds of user data to monitor engagement, including visitor numbers, visitor browsing history, and so on. And this is really important also in relation to the question of making money from fake news sites. And I will, in the interest of time, I will maybe not say too much about this because Craig will speak about an article done around this topic more. So maybe the only thing that I wanted to show when we speak about web trackers and strategies to collect user data and monetize content is this comparison of web trackers used on mainstream media sites and fake news sites, where we see that actually mainstream media appears to be a lot more mature in its use of trackers, while fake news sites can be said to be a bit cheaper in terms of tracker usage and to use fewer and more generic trackers. And I'll stop here and maybe hand over to Jonathan.
So I'm just going to say a little bit finally before we sort of move on about how the material that we produce has been sort of generated, as well as our plans for what will come next. The recipes are informed by a kind of digital methods approach, which many of us have contributed to through our teaching and research. But we also share an interest in public participation engagement around digital technologies and data infrastructures, which is informed by developments in our field of science and technology studies. As such, our focus is less on advancing particular legal or technical fixes and more on facilitating processes of public engagement, public understanding, and democratic deliberation, including provoking curiosity about different ways of seeing the issues and imagination about different ways in which we might respond differently. The material in this guide has been produced through a series of what we call data sprints. These are 5-day hands-on events in Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Milan, hosted by different members of the lab, which is a new initiative to facilitate research, democratic engagement, and public debate around the future of the data society. So after our launch here in Perugia, we're very interested in continuing to develop collaborative working formats to facilitate further encounters and collaboration between journalists, digital researchers, and others around data infrastructures, platforms, and algorithms. So with that, we're going to hand over to our colleagues.
Okay, so me and Angeles are researcher at Politecnico di Milano. Can you go to the next one? And we are part of Density Design Lab. Thank you. We are part of Density Design Lab, which is part of the design department of Politecnico di Milano, and is a teaching and research lab working in the field of information visualization. And it's a group composed by professors, PhD students, master students, and together, we try to explore new ways of using data and information visualization or new ways of using new sources. And so when Jonathan and Liliana told us this idea of making a field guide using new methods with unknown outputs and with unknown data, we were quite worried. And we were quite worried because we collaborate with them since many years, and we know that when you use digital methods, you start with an idea, and often you end up with something completely different. So the idea of designing a format able to contain very different kind of studies was, well, really challenging for us. And this is also the reason why we loved this project, because it was really not about designing a book or designing a visualization, but it was more about designing the collaboration among people, because as Jonathan said, many people participated to this to this guide. And so, well, actually, this project helped us also to rethink the way we design visualizations, and maybe we can speak about this later. What is important, I want just to synthesize the design approach that we used in the creation of this guide, which is actually based on 3 steps. The first one is the design of constraints. So we don't know what we want to do, but we know what we don't want to do, and Angeles will explain it better. And the second one is the co-design phase. So the idea was to actually communicate the process of this analysis, not just the result. So as designers, we took part to the data sprint, trying to follow the analysis path and keeping trace of it. And finally, the last part is the redesign of the results. So during the data sprint, we created a variety of different kind of output, and then we had to put all of them in a single format in this guide. So we had to redesign both the visualization, but also the text, and also sometimes we had to redesign the analysis.
Thank you, Michele. So we define constraints for 2 aspects of the field guide. One is the format, and the other is the content. So for the format, we think about the future interaction of the final user of the field guide. So we also defined that the field guide was going to be downloaded from internet into a PDF that could be printed at home. So in this way, we define a format very simple, A4, static visualizations for a pleasant reading. Defining the format gives us an idea of what could be possible or not to design, to think about the amount and complexity of the information that could be analyzed in the future visualizations of the field guide. You can't put an elephant inside a closet, so it was really important to know this matter. And for the content, we defined together, Liliana and Jonathan. So these are some visualizations of the very first templates. We defined some graphic elements, such as color palette, also typography and font size. This really helped us to work also in a very smart and quickly way. And yeah, for the content, we defined together with Liliana and Jonathan a structure for gathering all the possible content that could be produced during the data sprint in Amsterdam. And we decided to work with Google Drive since it was going to be a huge collective process. Let's keep in mind that the objective of the field guide is to show a process, not the results of beautiful visualizations. So for us as designers, it was really important to participate in the construction and analysis of the research with the rest of the team, especially because in the next phase, we will have to redesign that process and translate it for the final reader. In the last phase, we took everything and we put everything together. These are some pictures of that week where we work putting all together. And as we said, we expected that the results were very different, and they were really very different, believe me. So we tried to look for a structure and narrative that could put together and make sense for our reader. So we have chapters, recipes, steps, and visualizations for it. Yes. So the redesign of the field guide was done several times for the visualizations and also for its content. We rewrote and we redesigned visualizations many times during that week. And okay, for finishing, we want to show this image because it's very funny. During the process, we make a lot of jokes about the fake news and the fake field guide. But what I want to say is that with these 3 steps, we designed the field guide in a modular structure that allow us to continue with the field guide in future steps, adding new recipes, and at the same time allows us for future reshuffling of the recipes. So that's all.
Hi. So those of you who were in this room yesterday morning will know that I get a bit twitchy about the term fake news. So we did have a discussion when I said, do we have to call it that? And Liliana and Jonathan said, it's what people are interested in. So I also, because I'm just going to say this, I could not love these two more than I love them. They are single-handedly the most amazing people in the world. They emailed me in January and said, we're thinking of doing something next week in Amsterdam, can you come? And I said, I can't. And then after the end of the week, they said, we brought 1 million people together in Amsterdam and did loads of amazing stuff. Can you help support us to do that again in March? And then we're going to launch something in Perugia. People are doers, and then there's these two. And we're sitting here looking at this, and they make my eyes water because they're so amazing. So to get back to my problem with fake news, what I sort of love is that from a search engine optimization point of view, you are geniuses, and that all Trump haters are going to Google this, find it, and want to take it down and not understand a word once you start looking at this, because it's really detailed and very complex. So I sort of am letting you get away with this title. So anyway, I just needed to say that. So I'm going to be very, very brief. The reason that I think this is amazing is because we're not going to get anywhere, as discussed at previous conferences, by just talking about this at conferences. So we're only going to move this forward by actually doing research on this. And there's a whole host of different types of research that we need to do. And part of it, and the most important part, is the mapping part of this. And what I love about this, it's not that Jonathan and Liliana said, we're going to do the mapping, and we're going to take 2 years to do it, and then we're going to publish it in a journal that nobody reads. What they've actually gone and done is done something in 4 months, which means that everybody can replicate these methods. And for me, and for First Draft, the reason that we're so excited to support this research is we have to do this globally, and we have to do it with the same methods. Because otherwise, we're not actually going to move this forward if we're looking at this from different angles and using different methodologies and different perspectives. So I'm really excited to see what others do with these recipes. I do think we need to all have a discussion about terminology and what we're trying to understand here. But what you've raised in your 4 points is a really important starting point for us to come in and ask other questions and add to your methodologies with qualitative methods, other types of quantitative methodologies, do this globally. So anybody in the room who's really interested in this, I do think this idea of collaboration. And the last thing I'd say is, I'd heard about sprints before in a technical space, but I'd never heard it being applied to researchers. But putting 72 researchers in a room, even just feeding 72 researchers and getting them in one place, but then what you've managed to do in a week, I mean, I love researchers. I'm an academic by training myself. We don't often move quickly. And you prove that not only do we move quickly, but if you work with Italians, look how beautiful it can look. British people can't make things like this, but Italians, you're so stylish. So, so thank you very much for doing this. And I really am excited about what's possible. And I think in terms of feedback, we did ask some of our partners in First Draft, some journalists, to look at this. And we did get some really positive feedback about, this is amazing, but it's too technical for me. So we also have to think through how can we make these recipes available to all types of journalists who want to examine this. And that's something that we need to learn more about as well. So I owe you 1 million Aperol spritzes. Thank you for being amazing. And Craig's going to talk about... So Craig and I had a conversation at MisinfoCon, another conference about misinformation, and Craig was like, what's this that they're up to? And I said, go and talk to Liliana and Jonathan. They are doing really exciting things, and maybe BuzzFeed could do something with it. So that's what Craig's going to talk about.
Wow, what a segue. That's like perfect. So actually, just to build on one thing, I'll talk specifically about a way that we took something they did in the field guide and we turned it into a story, which I hope other people in the room will think about doing, and I think it's accessible to anyone. Don't worry about your technical expertise because they've got you covered. But to Claire's point about the challenge of online misinformation, not just the purely fake stuff, but also the mixture of stuff, the propaganda, all the different sort of flavors of it. In order for us to actually understand that world and for journalists to be able to document it, I think a lot of traditional journalistic methods are good for some parts of it, but we also need to understand this is stuff that's coming out of a network society. It's happening on platforms with massive scale, and it's impossible for us to, by interviewing a bunch of people, to actually understand what the hell is going on with all this. We need to apply apply digital methods that enable us to do analysis, that enable us to collect data. We need to apply good methodology that enables us to produce work that stands up. And I think there's a space. I'm spending more and more time working with researchers, and because I think there's a space that exists where traditional journalistic work, and I'm going to overgeneralize a little bit here, but often we're getting anecdotes, we're interviewing, maybe we go and we get data from other places and we put that into a story. And for researchers, they may spend months or years gathering data, figuring out their methodology, having it reviewed, gathering it, analyzing the data. So maybe it's submitted, to a peer review publication. Months and months and months go by, and then it's published, and then maybe journalists write about it then. I think there's a middle ground between those two things, that journalists should not be waiting until researchers are done. I think they should be talking at the early stages of things and figure out what can we do together that is going to enable us to do a story sooner, so we're capturing these things in their early stages, but that we also do things in a way that stands up and for your methodology that you can go and then get your peer-reviewed stuff done as well. I think we need to figure out ways that it serves both people. And there's more and more researchers that I talk to who are interested in doing that, and we just have to, you have to watch the methodology piece of it so that it stands up even though it hasn't yet gotten through the full peer-reviewed way. And there's different standards for each, but there's a minimum standard that has to be met. So all that to say, when I looked at, we contributed to the fake news guide by, myself and the other team member that kind of covers this area at BuzzFeed, Jane Litvinenko, we do a lot of spreadsheet stuff, but not complicated spreadsheet stuff. We just literally make lists. We see another shitty website, we put it on a spreadsheet. That's basically like what happens. And then we find out who owns it, and what's their Facebook page, and when was it started. And we maintain spreadsheets. So we sent them a spreadsheet of about 130 sites that publish 100% fake news, and we sent them a spreadsheet with about 600 hyperpartisan websites left and right in the US that we continue to build on, and we were talking at lunch today about what we're going to do next with that. And so we contributed that, and then when we reviewed it, we saw this project where they looked at the ad trackers. And the financial incentives for 100% false news, it's a big part of it. And so we looked at what they had gathered for the ad trackers, and we said, well, that's interesting, and we wanted to see, we said, well, which ad trackers were added most, and after November, once people started getting worried about this, and which ones were removed most, to try and figure out, were people getting kicked out of ad networks because Google was cracking down or what have you. So we started with that, and then we also realized that sometimes an ad tracker is present, but the ads themselves aren't. So then I did a manual review of 100 plus websites to actually look at the ads that were on their homepage and their story page. And so what we did in the end, to summarize it, is we took the data that was gathered through automated means, we combined it with some manual review, built spreadsheets of that, and then we also, for me, I went and I reached out to all the ad companies that we found on these fake sites and said, we found you serving ads on these sites. Do you have a comment on that? And also, are we correct that you're helping monetize these sites? And so we applied some journalistic methods to it, to get some quotes, to do a little bit of verification and fact checking, to add some manual labor on it. And so it became a kind of a hybrid story that was some automated stuff, some of the digital methods, and then some more traditional journalism. And we ended up publishing a story what was it? Was it this week? It was Monday, right? So this all happened in the span of about a week. We got their data and we put this together. We published a story on Monday showing that there are more than 60 sites that publish completely false hoaxes that are monetizing with some of the biggest programmatic ad networks out there. There are a bunch on AdSense. And we also, through collecting that data, saw what types of ad networks they're on. And we saw which networks had actually been kicking people out and which ones had actually been accepting fake sites. Even one that accepted a new fake site within hours of us publishing the story. So we took the data and we were able to add some layers of traditional journalism to it, and we were able to publish a piece that gave a picture of who's actually helping these sites get paid. And so I just encourage everybody, again, if you're a journalist in the room, if you're a researcher in the room, you guys should talk, and maybe you should come to the bar after with us and figure out how you can collaborate on things, because if we're going to actually tackle this stuff, as Claire said, we have to think about these kinds of approaches. It's not going to work just by doing one-offs, and we have to get a better sense of the whole picture, and we have to see how it evolves, because things are changing quite rapidly.
Cool. Okay. Wow. Agreed. So I guess we're doing really unexpected well for time. So we've got, wow, thank you guys. It's great. I thought we were going to have to, we're being right up against it. We have a little bit of room to breathe. So I guess the question, we can open up to the floor for questions. And then sort of we'll also move over to bar together sort of a little bit. But go ahead.
Hi, Nick Newman from the Royce Institute for the Study of Journalism. Great stuff, really interested in potential collaborations. I just wanted to ask a question about the definitions again. So it's a really difficult problem, how to have the complexity around all the nuance that you talk about, but also how to explain the story. And I just wondered if you could offer some alternatives at two levels. So one for the public, when we talk about these things at a headline term, what alternative there is. And then beneath that are the sort of a common definition of three different things that we can use for classifying lists, for example, that would then enable us to have research that was more comparable, which is something that I'm interested in. So questions, I guess, for all the panel.
Claire, you have to answer that because you're the one who's upset about terms.
Yeah, I'm upset. No, I mean, Nick, the reason that I did that kind of 7 types in January was just a really quick response to a frustration about definitions. And as an academic, you have to get your definitions right. I don't think it's too complex. And in many ways, it's also not, it's not, as complex as it could be. I mean, I don't have conspiracy in there, for example. But you're absolutely right. If, as an academic community, we're going to move on this collectively, we have to have shared definitions. So maybe we should have a sprint where we just talk about that. But I do, in terms of this overall term, I mean, misinformation ecosystem is not going to catch on. And it's mostly because it's too long for a hashtag. But I do like this idea of pollution, because I think about air quality, and that you have, if you think about an air quality meter, you have, different strengths or different types of air quality problems. And I think this idea of a polluted system, our information is polluted, and so and it comes to your shades of fakeness. But we're not there yet, but you're right. We can't just keep saying don't use it without coming up with another term. And the headline question is absolutely right. I mean, Facebook had clearly settled on false news. But I feel like news is problematic because a lot of this isn't news. It's, it's visual content, it's memes. So maybe, I'm struggling here, but you're absolutely right, Nick. We're not going to get anywhere if we don't have a way of comparing even methodologies. If I read your stuff and there was parts I was like, oh, doesn't fit in with my stuff. So, but not in an ownership way, but just in a, how do we make sure that we're being consistent?
I think we were taking a slightly different approach, which issues from the sort of tradition of research that we come from, which is to, in anthropology, you have this distinction between emic and etic. So the way in which a group of people use a term versus how you use that term as a researcher. And for us, I think it was fascinating. As soon as we saw this, this is a sort of, in a way, like a paradigm case of a controversy of classification and of labeling. And it was the politicization and the hyper-mediatization of this that we precisely thought was why it was, on the one hand, so sort of interesting, almost when you step back and don't think in terms of kind of what the sort of the issue is and sort of how to crack down on it. But you think of why is it that this is the thing that sort of we've all collectively turned to at this moment as a sort of way of understanding what's happening in the world at the moment, from the point of view of the anthropology of the sort of modernity of the situation they're in. Why is it that everyone's sort of suddenly sort of very concerned about Facebook? What does that tell us about how we organise society, what we think about information, what we think about media, what we think about democracy? So as researchers, I think we're kind of very interested in saying, well, actually, this should be turned into also part of the inquiry, like what is described as fake news, how that's defined in different settings, and indeed how that's operationalised and how that it can be used to automate judgment and automate this process of labelling classification, which have much broader societal consequences beyond kind of this issue, right? I mean, the sort of the automation of human judgment, or the semi-automation through various kinds of algorithmically mediated processes, is really sort of something that we've, part of the issue was also sort of having broader democratic and sort of public discussion around that and how we deal with it. I think it's interesting, in all these consultations, sort of the question is what is the issue and who is sort of responding to it?
But that's a nice moment of the researchers were like, this is fascinating. Yeah. And the journalist's like, I don't care what I'll put in my headline. And so there is that tension too, which we have to, cross over. And I think Greg's right, we're going to be doing more and more together we have to push the researchers a little more to be like, I know you're fascinated, but we need something right now. And we have to make sure that we're not simplifying what is a really complex issue.
Exactly. But that's precisely the approach we also took with the sort of, by looking at participatory design, because we're very aware that we have different kinds of cultures, and this is why this project in a way is the culmination of like several years of trying to do things with researchers and journalists. And I think we've been frustrated sort of on both sides in some ways, like different points.
But it's also interesting when you go globally, for example, recently hearing people from Korea talking about the Korean fake news. So when it gets translated, they're like, it doesn't directly translate, so it really is, what they're trying to say is this. And so then you realize that's also, when you start talking about fake news in many different languages, the complexity comes out there too.
Yeah, Maarten Schenk of Trendalizer, leadstories.com. You've talked about the ad networks on a lot of these fake news sites, and professionally I spend a lot of time looking at these sites to debunk their stories. My impression is that a lot of the advertising on these sites is typically the sort of advertising aimed at gullible people, like penis enlargements, get-rich-quick schemes, herbal supplements, weight loss pills, and all that kind of stuff. But I was wondering if you had done any research into that or were planning to, because I think it might be an interesting question to see, do these two things play into each other? Stories that target gullible people have ads on them that also work on gullible people.
Yeah, we'd love to do a study of just capturing all the ads that are presented on fake news sites. So we haven't done that yet, but actually Craig has spent a few days looking at ads on all these websites, so he can.
I might have bought some pills, okay? Just like leave me alone, dude.
How's your belly fat?
So yeah, they are the junky quality of ads. What happened is. Back in like the fall and before that, a lot of these sites were able to get into Google AdSense and higher end display ad networks where you would see larger brands. And as Google cracked down and kicked people out, they mostly went to those related content ad modules, where they're sort of at the bottom of the story or the side where they're often clickbaity type headlines. And so in some cases, mostly really big brands don't usually advertise through those networks. It's often other websites trying to get traffic. And it is also, frankly, some ads that are that mislead. They try to look like People Magazine, for example, to sell a supplement, as you said. So it is a junkier quality of ad. That being said, though, tons of high-end and reputable media websites are also running those types of ads from some of the very same providers. Not all of them, but from some of them. So now that being said, there's also some sites that they're on like the third tier of these. They'll get booted out of Outbrain, for example, and then they go down to like Content.ad or AdBlade, which get worse, progressively worse. So they are being booted down the food chain, and as a result, the ads are getting junkier and junkier. And there's actually some sites, and I know you're familiar with them, Martin, where literally if you click anywhere on the website, it takes you to a pop-out ad. So like it's not anywhere on the website, a link, anything, not even an ad itself, they're set up. And those are actually trying to get people to install browser extensions. And those browser extensions are kicked out of the Chrome store like every few weeks, and then they come in with a new one. So it's very much at the low end, and it probably is tricking a lot of people. But all that to say, yes, I have a story I'm going to do on a specific ad network next week, and we're thinking about other things we can do related to it. Yeah.
Just very quickly for advertising, in the Philippines, they have a real problem with imposter content when journalists' bylines are being used to sell cosmetics and their images are being used to sell cosmetics. So, yeah, this stuff just gets more and more weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have another question? Oh, wow, okay. There we go. Here's one. I love the idea that maybe it's all very self-explanatory.
Hello, I have a question. I'm graduated in philosophy, so maybe I'm biased, but I want to ask you if philosophy is useful in fake news research, philosophy of science or epistemology.
Sorry, say one more time.
Philosophy is always useful.
Yes, but how in this research?
Did you say you're a philosopher?
Yeah. How can I be useful in...
Oh, you could be useful. Let's have an Aperol Spritz together. No, I mean... I'm really passionate about creating a new science of misinformation. So we're talking here from an academic perspective. One of the problems with academic disciplines is that they have their own journals. And so people have to publish in the Journal of Communication or the American Journal of Anthropology. So when we think about these issues, it's actually not in anybody's interest to be working in a cross-disciplinary way, despite people talking in that way. So we kind of need to create the new Journal for Disinformation, which says that we bring together philosophers and anthropologists and network scientists and social psychologists and all the people that are coming at this question from a different perspective, because philosophy absolutely is crucial to us understanding the definitions of this and what this means and what, the philosophy of truth. Is anybody here from France? So we're running cross-check. No, this is great. I love it. We're running cross-check in France, where we have 37 different French newsrooms collaborating in real time, debunking information about the French election. And what's so great when you look at the Slack conversations, because it's France, is French journalists discussing the philosophy of truth. And what does this mean? And so actually there's a huge role for this, and we need to be having those conversations. So let's have a drink. But yes, anybody in here who is interested in disinformation and it comes from any particular angle, let's have that place where we all go. Maybe just Perugia next year. Yeah. Let's just do a sprint in Perugia for a week before. Not afterwards, because we're too tired afterwards. And actually do this stuff. Maybe we haven't got a year, though. Let's just do Perugia next month.
Okay. I want to weigh in, Claire. 2 of the Median team members are philosophy majors. So some of the infrastructure that's working on this is driven by philosophy majors. So we want to be part of the Aperol party later.
I was just going to add, I think sort of one of the big things that we wrote about for the Nieman lab piece that kind of came out last night was also really thinking about what's happening here and trying to really sort of broaden the public imagination around the response. I think is really important, not just to deal with the sort of cracking down on fake news kind of effectively, but also, I mean, this is what we also love about some of Craig's work is, and we were sort of talking about a little bit over lunch, is trying to find ways of narrating and making meaning around and kind of trying to sort of reimagine how we can democratically participate in shaping the future of the world that we live in. That's philosophers can be very useful in that. But I mean, I think a lot of this is extremely non-trivial. How we can sort of do this, and I think we see that this is part of the issue at the moment, in the sort of the way that different people are trying to respond to fake news is an issue. Whether it's sort of, and who responds? Is it sort of fines? Is it sort of public policy? Is it sort of market-based solutions? Are we sort of and the division of responsibility is we do a lot of sort of further thinking around that. But I think that may be. Yeah, that's our sign for 1 minute, right? So we are done. Yeah. We are, as I said earlier, we're going to be heading over to the Brafani bar. So if you're interested in finding out more, please join us. And finally, one last thing. The guide really was a collective effort. And there's a lot of students and researchers who couldn't be with us here today, but who will no doubt watch this video stream. So I would ask you to join me one last time in thanking them for their contribution who can't be here. Thank you. Thank you.
That's great. So when will the finished product?
Oh, that's a very good question, because these are the only 3 first chapters.
Yeah.
And the idea is to work on the next 3 chapters.
Yeah.
So far I know. And then I'm not sure.
Welcome. Please come and take a seat, and we'll get started. So in this session, we are delighted to be officially launching the first part of a field guide to fake news, which is the first project of a new initiative called the Public Data Lab, in collaboration with and with support from First Draft. So thank you very much for being here today with us, especially late on a Friday afternoon in this beautiful city. Instead of cutting a ribbon or smashing a bottle, I guess this will have to be it. This is the moment. It's now live. You can sort of get the guide at this link.
And there's also printed.
And there's also a printed. There is one of these in the world, so this is sort of it. We could maybe pass it around if anyone's interested in having a look. So this is the 3 chapters of a collaboration that we've been doing. But just to kind of say what we're going to kind of do in this session, first of all, Liliana and I are going to say a little bit about what the guide is and why we were interested in creating it, what it does and what we'd like to do with it next. And that potentially may involve working with some of the people in this room, other people who are sort of interested in exploring its various sort of recipes and approaches. Then our colleagues here from Density Design at the Politecnico di Milano, Michele and Angeles, are going to tell us a little bit more about the design process and data visualizations that are intended to facilitate different ways of exploring and understanding fake news phenomena online. And then we're delighted to have Claire Wardle with us from First Draft, who's been extremely busy on lots of panels, I think, who will say a little bit about where the guide fits.
And I will go through each of them very briefly. And these are also based on a forthcoming paper proposing some new lines of inquiry about fake news done with colleagues in Copenhagen and Paris. The first proposition explored in the guide is that, also as Claire's work suggests, rather than focusing on the distinction between true and false, between fake and real, we should consider investigating the full spectrum of fabricated, half-baked, contested, alternative, and temporary facts. And in the field guide, we illustrate this through a case study on Russian information campaigning online. So Russia's online information campaigning has been described as being part of a form of hybrid warfare, whereby a weaker power provides strategic narrative input to amplify existing splits in targeted societies, as well as to undermine trust in democratic institutions. In the guide, we explore different shades of fabrication in a collection of Russian misinformation stories compiled by East Stratcom and the European Disinformation Review. So the European Disinformation Review is an EU service to address Russia's ongoing disinformation campaigns. So contributors to the field guide identified 3 flavors or 3 styles of Russian information campaigning online. So there is what we are accustomed to refer to as fake news. So that's fabricated stories served as clickbait to generate ad revenue, and that also mimics some of the features of mainstream news stories. So the focus on personalities, the focus on human interest, and so on. There is also a lot of conspiracy, which is really interesting. So these are more complex plots that multiply actors and their connections. And there is also disinformation. So this takes the style of hard facts and acts as a weapon to disorient and undermine established
research on the other to see how they might be able to learn from each other. Our broad objective is to enrich public debate, reportage, policy making, and practice around fake news. That's a sort of broader aim, and to catalyse collective inquiry, drawing on different fields of expertise and experience that are required to make sense of this complex and fast-evolving issue. So the work is inspired by a long democratic pragmatist tradition going back to people like John Dewey that proposes to look more closely at the composition of democratic societies, what they do, how they are organised, and what moves them and holds them together. With the Public Data Lab, we're very aware of the limitations and our finitude as a small network of researchers. Hence, is our greatest hope that the value of this guide will not be what lies within its pages, but what other people, other organisations, other journalists will go and do with it. So that's what we'd like to kind of talk with you more about a little bit later. Our focus has been less on a particular set of findings than on providing a set of procedures and approaches which can be used to find fresh perspectives and different ways of looking at the issue. So we suggest a shift in the guide from the formal content of fake news phenomenon to understanding its circulation and its social life online. And this shift suggests the limits of an approach which is exemplified by what has been called the information deficit model of communication, which might imply that fake news thrives because of a deficit of factual information. In the guide, we suggest new ways of mapping and responding to fake news beyond identifying and fact-checking suspect claims, including thicker accounts of circulation as a way to develop richer understandings of how fake news moves and mobilizes people, and more nuanced accounts of fakeness and what it is, responses which are more attuned to the phenomenon. So, as we mentioned in the introduction, we adopt the metaphor of a field guide to encourage people to explore different ways of following how fake news moves in the wild. We also adopt the metaphor of a recipe book as we give people a set of procedures that are intended to provide a starting point for experimenting with different ways of approaching this issue and the sort of phenomena that are associated with it. And finally, we adopt the metaphor of a mystery thriller, as in the pursuit of solving an apparently relatively straightforward and simple crime, we find that the plot thickens, the cast grows, the questions multiply, and there may be many unexpected twists or changes of perspective along the way. And this is something that we wrote about for a piece for the Nieming Lab, which came out in the early hours of this morning, which looks at how, in investigating fake news, we also learn many interesting things about ourselves and about collective life online. Fake news, we contend, involves more than a few rogue producers or state conspiracies and raises important and also difficult questions about the digital technologies that organize collective life. And so now you have a sense of some of our aspirations in putting together the guide. We'll give you a preview of some of its content, organized around 4 observations around fake news that have emerged from our research.
Yeah, so I get the pleasure to run you through some of the things that are in the sample of the field guide that is online as of today. And I will also give you a preview of some of the things which are not yet in this version of the field guide, but which will be released in early May. So as Jonathan mentioned, the field guide is organized into methodological recipes to open up imagination about how fake news can be investigated and understood. But for the purposes of this presentation, I will organize these into 4 propositions about fake news, which I will try to illustrate with some of the empirical work from the guide. So you can see them here on the screen.
Within First Draft's broader kind of mission to improve skills and standards around the reporting and sharing of information that emerges online. And finally, last but not least, we will hear from the great Craig Silverman of BuzzFeed News, whose innovative and in-depth investigations have really raised the bar, I think, for reporting around this issue, as well as sort of around platforms and sort of the web in general. And who'll talk a little bit about some recent, a recent collaboration and potentially some other collaborations that we'll be doing around this area. But that is not the end. So after this session, we'll go to the Profani Bar. So anyone who is potentially interested in catching up about any of this work and who might be interested in road testing some of these approaches, please come and talk to us. We'll be in the bar. So I guess first of all, we are extremely happy to be back in Perugia again. As I mentioned in a panel earlier this week, it was 5 years ago this month when we first launched a project called the Data Journalism Handbook here at the festival. And there are several of the people in the room today, I think Farida and a few others who are also involved in that. A huge amount has happened in the last 5 years in this field and in the world generally. So we're currently working on a new edition of the book to reflect some of these changes. And over the past few years, Liliana and I have had one foot in the world of kind of data journalism and worlds of data journalism and data activism. Liliana's been involved heavily with the European Journalism Centre's data journalism program, and I've helped to establish an international civil society organization called Open Knowledge International. And we've also had one other foot in the world of research, in particular sort of in the fields of digital methods and science and technology studies. So the guide is part of a series of interventions to try to facilitate productive encounters between these two worlds, between journalism and activism on the one hand and